However you are and whenever you are, you're listening to Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network. I'm your host, Alan B. Smith, and join us as we traverse the cosmic highway of paranormal pit stops and tantalizing turnoffs. I'm very excited, as I expect you would be too, to speak with our guests tonight, Kathleen Marden and Stanton Friedman, to discuss the Roswell UFO incident in just a few minutes. Now, if you're a regular listener to IRN, we have an IRN smartphone app where you can listen to the live stream from home, on the road, or from a greasy diner somewhere off a dusty road. The app also allows you to chat with other listeners, provides show lineups, and other information and tools. If you're just finding us, please like Paranormal Now on Facebook at Paranormal Now Radio, or on Instagram at Paranormal Now. A brief reminder, you can also listen to IRN's 24/7 stream using Live 365, Stitcher Radio, Nobex Radio, TuneIn, iTunes Radio, Streama, Shoutcast, Winamp, WinMedia Player, QuickTime, and also on the IRN Roku channel. And if you have access to a computer or a smartphone, you can call from your landline or cell phone to listen to the free 24 hours, 7 days a week broadcast, which is 401-283-6700. Now, this is a podcast, as I say every week, so although we are broadcast on a regularly scheduled program every Saturday, we are not actually live, so please don't try to call in. And now for your paranormal words of wisdom.
Hey guys, it's Eliana. So as a very young woman still just beginning to research this paranormal phenomena, my words of wisdom would be to start with inner knowledge. Get to know yourself and start to hone your intuition so you can use it as a way to help you discern what is the truth. Because along your research, you'll find disinformation or unreliable sources. So the thinking mind is absolutely something to be utilized, but it pales in comparison to the inner wisdom of your intuition. Enjoy this episode of Paranormal Now, and follow us on Instagram at Mind Altering Media.
And that was your Paranormal Now Words of Wisdom by Eliana from Mind Altering Media. You can find out more about her on IG at Mind Altering Media, and her website is mindalteringmedia.com. My guests are, first, Kathleen Marden is a leading researcher of contact with non-human intelligence, an author and lecturer. Her educational background in the social sciences has shaped her interest in scientific ufology. Extensive research and investigation into alien abduction has convinced her that some abductions are real. She earned a BA in social work from the University of New Hampshire and participated in graduate studies in education while working as a teacher and education services coordinator. Her scholarship led to acceptance into the Alpha Kappa Delta Sociological Honor Society during her 15 years as an educator. She innovated, designed, and implemented model educational programs. She also held a supervisory position, coordinating, training, and evaluating education staff. Her interest in UFOs dates back to September 20th, 1961, when her aunt, Betty Hill, phoned her childhood home to report that she and Barney had encountered a flying saucer in New Hampshire's White Mountains. A primary witness to the evidence of the UFO encounter and the aftermath, Kathleen has intimate knowledge of the Hills' biographical histories, investigation files, and scientific interest in their sensational experience. Now, this led to a journey of exploration, leaving no stone unturned, to find answers through scholarly work, investigation, and social research. She is recognized as the world's leading expert on the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. She is associated with the Mutual UFO Network as its Director of Experiencer Research and the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Encounters, also known as FREE, as an advisory board member and consultant to its research subcommittee. She was a recipient of MUFON's 2012 Excellence in Ufology Award. She makes it clear that the opinions expressed by her are her own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the organization of which she is a member. Kathleen has written 3 books with nuclear physicist, scientific ufologist Stanton Friedman, captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, Science Was Wrong, and Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers, and 1 book, The Alien Abduction Files with Denise Stoner. She is currently working on MUFON's Experiencer Survey, which will hopefully be completed by the end of 2017, which we are very close to. So we'll have to ask Kathleen about that. Kathy has given expert testimony on the Discovery, History, H2, National Geographic, and Destination American channels. That's a lot of information right there, and a whole history of valuable research just from Kathleen. Now, our second guest is nuclear physicist lecturer Stanton T. Friedman, who received his BSc and MSc degrees in physics from the University of Chicago in 1955 and 1956. He was employed for 14 years as a nuclear physicist by such companies as GE, GM, Westinghouse, TRW Systems, Aerojet, General Nucleonics, and McDonnell Douglas, working in such highly advanced classified, eventually canceled programs as nuclear aircraft, fission and fusion rockets, and various compact nuclear power plants for space and terrestrial applications. He became interested in UFOs in 1958, and since 1967 has lectured about them more than about 600 colleges and 100 professional groups in 50 U.S. states, 10 Canadian provinces, and 18 other countries, in addition to various nuclear consulting efforts. He has published more than 90 UFO papers and has appeared on hundreds of radio and TV programs, including on Larry King in 2007 and twice in 2008, and many documentaries. He is the original civilian investigator of the topic we are speaking about tonight, the Roswell incident, and co-authored Crash at Corona, the definitive study of the Roswell incident, which changed the investigative field of ufology forever. Top Secret Magic, his controversial book about the Majestic 12 group, established in 1947 to deal with alien technology, was published in 1996 and went through 6 printings. An expanded new edition was published in 2005. Stan was presented with a Lifetime UFO Achievement Award in Leeds, England in 2002 by UFO Magazine of the UK. He is co-author with Kathleen Marden. We've covered those books, so I will skip this portion. His book, Flying Saucers and Science, was published in June 2008 and is in its 3rd printing. His newest book, also authored by Kathleen Marden, is Science Was Wrong, released in June 2010. And that is not his most recent book, so we'll have to have Stan comment on that. He has provided written testimony to congressional hearings, appeared twice at the UN, and been a pioneer in many aspects of ufology, including Roswell, Majestic 12, the Betty Hill Marjorie Fish star map work, analysis of the Delphos, Kansas physical trace crash, one of the best out there, crashed saucers, flying saucer technology, and challenges to the SETI, silly effort to investigate, I love it, cultists. He has spoken at more MUFON symposia than anyone else. Stanton T. Friedman is a dual citizen of the USA and Canada. Woo, I got through that. Welcome to the show, Stan and Kathleen.
Thank you.
Hi.
Great to be back with you.
Oh, welcome back. It's my absolute pleasure. So yeah, if there's anything else that you guys feel like you needed to add in there, please just jump in and fill us in.
That's more than you need.
I think you've covered it all.
All right. And we've got a lot to talk about tonight, of course. So I know we've heard my voice more than usual at the top of the show. However, I'm going to read something here for you. This is something that kind of touches a very nostalgic place in my heart. So just bear with me, and then I'll ask for your feedback after you hear what I have to read here. So this is from an article from some years ago. A cloud of brown dust snakes behind me as I speed down the desolate desert road. A dozen miles ago, I passed the solitary steel mailbox that marks the turnoff for Area 51, for a place that isn't supposed to exist. It's odd that the secret air base occupies whole chapters of aviation history. It was here, in 1955, that the U-2 spy plane first took wing. In the years that followed, its successors, the A-12 and SR-71, and later the stealthy F-11-7A fighter and B-2 bomber, danced across the same blue steel Nevada sky. Rumors persist of even more amazing aircraft. Secret hangars supposedly concealed the mythical Aurora, a methane-burning replacement for the high-flying SR-71 spy plane. And if you believe that X-Files and J. Edgar Hoover's dress collection exists, there are even crashed UFOs the engineers patched up and somehow learned how to fly. I'm not searching for hypersonic aircraft or ET's flying machine. My mission is less lofty. I'm trying to avoid getting arrested. When Popular Mechanics correspondent Abe Dane traveled these roads to research our January 1995 cover story, Flying Saucers Are Real, camouflaged guards driving white Jeep Cherokees dogged his every turn. Now, if I had to ask you guys, could you guess what year that was written?
I don't know.
No idea.
Right, exactly. So that was 1995. So recently, my wife and I were moving, and as we were uncovering things, I found this old Popular Mechanics magazine that I had saved. So, and I read through it, and I thought, anyone could have written this today, and you would be telling the same story. So, I guess my question is, in the past couple of decades, how much more have we learned?
Oh boy, that's a toughie. Are you saying about UFOs or about life in the universe?
I would say more Area 51 oriented, since we're going to be talking about Corona and Roswell tonight.
Well, okay. We've certainly turned up more witnesses to Roswell, but they're dead. I mean, there is a DVD, Recollections of Roswell, which has testimony from 27 first-hand witnesses, all but one of whom are dead. I mean, it happened 70 years ago, so that's not surprising. There have been some changes, though, that are significant. One is the attitude of the world. Our attitude, we Earthlings, I'm presuming you're an Earthling, we Earthlings have come to realize that rather than being, here we are on Earth, the king of the planets, and the only planet in the solar system that's got water and oxygen and so forth on the surface, and there's no other solar system around. That was an attitude not too many years ago. Mm-hmm. Today we know that the number that's given by the scientific community is 1.6 planets per star. So rather than stars, Frank Drake once said there might be as many as 8,000 in the galaxy. Now the number that we talk about is 100 billion. So planets are all over the place. There's 10,000 planets within 100 light years of here. 10,000 stars, and about 16,000 planets. So rather than being the big shots, the unique, the special place, it looks like we're run-of-the-mill as far as I can tell. I hate to say that, we want to be special. But so that there's a different attitude, in other words. And there are very few people who say now that we're alone in the universe, that there's nobody out there. We've also learned a lot about energy production and ways to get from here to there. So there have been changes in our perception of ourselves, of the local neighborhood. Now, we haven't learned a lot about more the classified activity that's been going on about this subject. Not much declassified as far as I can tell. Not in the last umpteen years. So that would be one area I'd like to see more work done on. Hey guys, fess up, give us the paperwork. But that would lead to, a push for people on the planet to think that we're all Earthlings and that there are aliens out there. And I guess there's some people who don't want us to think that way.
Yeah, and I wonder, more specifically to the article too, as far as advanced technology, because last time we spoke, Stan, you spoke quite a bit about interstellar travel and the feasibility built into physics for that. And in this article, it talks about the Aurora, the B-2, the SR-71. Since then, have we heard of any other more advanced aircraft that really fascinates you? That may have actually
not
been.
Really.
No.
No, I don't think so. I'm not saying there aren't any out there in secret.
Mm-hmm. But to your knowledge,
but to my knowledge, there are no new super duper hyper special high performance aircraft out there. And if there are, we're not talking about them. Whether that's to fool the Russians and the Chinese and others, I don't know who are working on their super duper aircraft. I don't know. Yeah. But we have recognized that we're not the big shots in the neighborhood, which is probably a good thing. Although, it's interesting. Within the last 2 months, almost 2 months ago, there was a special issue of Scientific American devoted to life in the universe. And just within the past 2 weeks, Newsweek magazine had a special edition, 100 pages long, loaded with pictures, and it's called Life Beyond Earth, ? The mission to find the answer. Small print says, exploring the universe with researchers, astronomers, eyewitnesses, and more. I don't know, what more do you want? So that's 2 major magazines, and they both do mention UFOs, and not in a nasty, stupid sort of way. You know, they don't talk about those UFO nuts or anything like that. So we're making progress. And both of us wish that they had mentioned our books, but they've mentioned quite a few books and quite a few researchers. So we'll have to catch the next special around, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I think you bring up an interesting point, too. Oh, no, go ahead, Stan.
No, just that, you know, the times have changed when 2 major publications can take a decent attitude toward UFOs and life. You know, most of the SETI community, the silly effort to investigate community, you know, that I talk about, they ignore UFOs. They don't want to talk about them. Obviously, people say, why? If aliens are visiting here, then who needs to listen with a radio telescope? Right. Maybe you need sign language, you know, for next time you happen to meet an alien. I don't know. So there have been changes, and we're getting there.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the research into ufology is that there is a periphery of other fascinating topics that, you know, are associated directly to this study, and you know, so I wonder, Kathleen, maybe you want to take this. Because I know you've done a lot of work for MUFON and Free in particular, and you know I've worked with via the airwaves with Dr. Joseph Burks with Epic Voyages Radio, so we've talked a lot about experiencers and you know, what people have seen as far as, you know, the more fringe reports of extraterrestrial beings. So where I'm leading with this is, you know, what is a UFO nut? I mean, you know, is there a place where you say, okay, this person is crossing a line? Is there a line?
I believe that there is, and the reason I say that is that normally when I interview individuals, they tell me the facts. Mm-hmm. They might express their emotional reaction to the experience. But they don't play upon conspiracy theory very much. Okay. But occasionally I find a witness who is completely absorbed in conspiracy theories, and the information that they are sharing with me is obviously coming off the internet, and they'll even encourage me to start investigating these conspiracy theories. So I consider those individuals to be UFO nuts, and you know, different from your mainstream UFO interested individual or your mainstream witness to UFOs or mainstream contactee or abductee.
And Stanton, you know, did most of the work earlier on to show the world, like, hey, you know what? There is a way to prove that something's going on here without physical trace evidence, you know, or eyewitness reports. You know, it's in the documentation. The government has ostensibly admitted it. And, you know, that opened up a whole wide field of research that I don't think was, you know, really there before, other than some, you know, well-written books that just, you know, hadn't quite caught fire yet.
Yeah, I'm very pleased that we don't do research by proclamation. We do research by investigation. And there is a difference. And the key word for us is evidence. Stories aren't good enough. We need evidence. Like, I've been to 20 archives, document archives. That's where you get solid stuff. You know, stories are easy to come by. Science fiction has been written for a very long time. But what we want is evidence. And so it's the effort we're trying to push for people is to gather evidence. It's not just testimony. Testimony is part of it. But, in the physical trace cases, we'd like to have measurements made of the characteristics of the soil that's been affected by the saucer that came down in that area. We want analysis of photographs. Not just isn't that a neat picture of a flying saucer, but what can we say when we look at it very carefully from a professional viewpoint? And so it's become fascinating to see the distinction. And there are fewer, I think, of the people who wave their hands, as Kathy says, with conspiracy stuff, and stories that they've heard. I must say I was rather disappointed. I read the proceedings of the last MUFON conference in Las Vegas. It was about the secret space program. And I read the proceedings, all the papers, and what was missing was evidence. There were great stories, but evidence? I mean, I can prove to you, for example, that the National Security Agency, the NSA, or as popularly known as Never Says Anything, or No Such Agency, pick your choice. But we know that they released 156 pages of top secret Umbra UFO documents. And the only trouble was you could read one sentence per page. And yet I get people telling me, there is no secret material. There's no classified material left about UFOs. You can get anything these days. That's nonsense. I worked under security for 14 years. I will guarantee you that secrets can be kept. There's lots of stuff still classified. Let's face it, we went after the CIA, Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, for their UFO documents, and first they released a few, and then a listing, and then finally we got over 700 pages of secret or confidential CIA UFO documents, heavily redacted. And it took another several years before it could get them to release a bunch of top secret Umbra UFO documents. They're all blacked out. No cover-up. Well, I'll tell you, I don't know what's underneath that black ink, but scraping it won't do it. There's nothing there to see.
Did you try?
You get Xerox copies. Well, you get Xerox copies of the originals. They don't send you the originals. I've had people say, well, why don't you just scrape off the black and see what's underneath? Well, there ain't nothing underneath. Not on what we get. So there's a certain mythology about UFOs, which, people choose to believe what they choose to believe, regardless of the evidence. But there is enormous evidence that's led me, and I think Kathy, to believe that some UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft, that the government is putting forth a cosmic Watergate, that we're dealing with proof that the Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial vehicles, and we're dealing with one of the biggest stories of the millennium. I don't say 2 millennia because then people start to argue about religion, and I don't want to get involved in that.
Well, right, but and then you can cross over into the ancient aliens discussion, and that's not really where we'll be going tonight. Kathleen, are you very familiar with the Roswell incident? I know that may not necessarily be your main area of focus, but what is your overall sense of what happened there? Was there an actual alien crash?
I do believe there was, and I think that it's important to place what happened in Roswell within the time frame of what was going on in this country and with our Army Air Force at that time. And on June 24th, 1947, just a couple of weeks before the Roswell newspaper reported in its headlines that a flying disc had been recovered near Roswell, Kenneth Arnold, up in Washington, in the Cascade Mountains, was out searching for a downed Marine C-46 transport plane when he saw 9 crescent-shaped discs. One of those discs actually had a double crescent on the back, and they were highly unusual. It was reported in the media. It was even later determined that they were traveling nearly 3 times as fast as any plane in that time frame. There were witnesses on the same day who saw vehicles in the air with similar descriptions and had reported that as well. The American public became fascinated with this and really showed a lot of interest in what was going on. People were out looking into the sky at night, and more reports were made. But there was a minister who told his congregation that this signaled the end of the earth, and it upset a lot of people. And so not many days after, it was only 6 days later, Brigadier General Roger Ramey, who was the commanding officer at the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas, the same general who worked on the Roswell crash, had a press conference with his chief intelligence officer and told the public not to worry, that it was not an extraterrestrial craft or crafts that Kenneth Arnold observed, but it was only weather phenomena. So it wasn't long thereafter that Mac Brazel heard a noise at night. And there were a lot of thunderstorms in Roswell at that time of the year, a lot of loud clashing noises. But he said that this was highly unusual, that it was not thunder that he heard. And so the next morning, he and a little boy who was one of his neighbor's sons went out on their horses to explore, to see what that was all about, see if he could find any evidence. And what he saw was a lot of evidence that something had fallen to the ground, and it was scattered over a wide area. There was a gouge in the soil, and there were fragments of this material that had highly unusual properties in an area about 3/4 of a mile long and several hundred feet wide. And he was having a problem because he was tending the sheep out there, and the sheep would not cross that area. So he had to move the sheep around that area. And then he went into a bar. It was called the Wade Bar in nearby Corona, New Mexico. And he had some pieces of that material with him. He had seen weather balloons before. He knew what they looked like. Mm-hmm. But this was highly unusual, had highly unusual properties.
Okay,
and
let's hold it right there. We're
yes.
at the first break. And we're speaking about highly unusual things. This is Alan B. Smith on the Inception Radio Network. This is Paranormal Now, and we'll be right back.
Hello, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Remember, you can take your Inception Radio shows on the go. Just download the Inception Radio Network app for your iPhone, iPad, or Android smartphones and access live shows, past shows, guest lineups, and much more. Just visit the iTunes Store or the Google Play Marketplace and download it today for free. You didn't forget what's coming up tonight, did you? Hi, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Never miss that interview you were looking forward to or the show on your favorite topic. Follow IRN on Twitter, I_R_N, and get reminders about the evening's live shows as well as fun and important updates throughout the week. That's I_R_N, and never miss a great show again.
Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith, your host, and tonight I am speaking with Stanton Friedman and Kathleen Marden, and taking us out of the break was Bulletproof by LaRue. If you're new to listening to Paranormal Now, you can always find me on Instagram. It's at Paranormal Now, or you can go to Facebook at Paranormal Now Radio. Stanton, what website can people find most of your books and works at?
www.stantonfriedman.com. Very easy. And Friedman is Friedman. Some people want to reverse the I and the E, so you got to get it right.
And for you, Kathleen?
And it's www.Kathleen with a K -Marden, MARDEN.com.
All right, fantastic. So we left it off at finding debris that should have been easily identified if it were a weather balloon. But
yes, weather balloons fell from the sky frequently in that area. So the people who lived in that area, and especially people like Mac Brazel, who was out working on a ranch, would come across downed weather balloons all the time. So
they worried about the one important thing to the ranchers was some of the cattle and especially the sheep tended to eat anything that was around, and the last thing they wanted was any of their animals eating foil-like material from weather balloons.
Yes, it was paper-backed too.
Right, and I think you make a really good point there, because anybody who's into or is a farmer, a rancher, no matter what their education may be, they have to have a certain amount of keen perception in order to do what they do well. And knowing your environment and knowing the things that could hurt your animals, hurt your crops, things to avoid, I would think you might not get any keener eyes than the likes that we're speaking of here.
Certainly more than the usual city guys.
Oh, absolutely. I know people here that are afraid to leave the city, so the woods scare them. So I'm sorry, Kathleen. So let's continue on with where you left off there.
Yes. So somebody told him that if he could take that wreckage to the Air Force, or the Army actually, base in Roswell, that he would be able to collect a $3,000 reward. So on July 6th, he drove that 75 miles from his place to Roswell, and he got in touch with Jesse Marcel, who was the base intelligence officer, and met with him and showed him the wreckage that he had. And then later that day, he and Jesse Marcel, and also a man by the name of Cavett, who was also a counterintelligence officer at the base, made the trip back to the ranch. And Jesse Marcel was driving his vehicle. Officer Cavett was in an Army vehicle. And Jesse Marcel was in his vehicle, I believe. I'm not positive. Not Jesse Marcel. Yes, Mac Brazel. Mac Brazel.
Yes.
I believe was driving his vehicle, but I'm not positive about that. So they arrived.
They followed him out, so yes, he was driving his vehicle.
Okay. Thanks, Stan. He knows a lot more about it than I do. He was the original investigator on this, and I have learned what I could from Stan and from reading several books on it. Mm-hmm. And I have written a little bit about it as well in some of our books, but I am by no means an expert. But as the story goes, they went back out to the ranch. The two Army men spent the night in a little shack or house building at the ranch, and then the next day they went out to the area where the debris was. They collected some of this debris. Jesse Marcel filled up his vehicle with it, and he drove it back by his house before he went to the base. And Officer Cavett did the same, but he did not stop at his house. And then Jesse Marcel took some of the remnants into his kitchen, laid it out on the floor in front of his wife and his 11-year-old son. And they had the opportunity to see it too. It was metallic debris with properties, unusual properties, like memory metal, fiber optics. There were I-beam fragments, and also his son later wrote a book about it. He became a medical doctor, a flight surgeon, and he wrote the book called The Roswell Legacy, about his father and about his memories of growing up in that family and what he saw when he was an 11-year-old boy. The story ended up being carried to the radio station. And Stan, would you like to pick up from there?
Well, yeah, they made the announcement at the radio station, and the press story went out from the base, and it hit the wire service. It went from Roswell to Albuquerque, and then Albuquerque had access to the news wire, and it went all over the country. Probably as much as anything else because of Kenneth Arnold's sighting 2 weeks before. There were hundreds of sightings in that intervening time frame. Yeah. So suddenly, those were all of things in the sky or near the ground. But suddenly, one crashed. Wow! They didn't know what it was, but it didn't. Jesse had seen crashed airplanes, and there are certain things you expect to find in crashed airplanes. First of all, they make a big hole in the ground, a crater, if you will, when they go in. Second, you find standard stuff, vacuum tubes, little tags saying made in Oshkosh. There's nothing strange about airplane wreckage. Pieces of metal from the parts of the airplane and the equipment that's on board, but there wasn't anything like that. When I talked to Jesse, that was one of the things he stressed. There wasn't anything conventional out there. And he suggested that there must have been a mid-air explosion for two reasons. The wreckage covered such a large area. He had seen crashed aircraft. And second, there was so much of it. And it was so different. So right away, that this wasn't something conventional that gradually they thought, well, maybe it's something weird. It was weird right from the start.
And Stan, they didn't have Mylar balloons, those silver foily type balloons in that time frame, did they? They only had neoprene balloons. So that couldn't possibly be mistaken for memory metal.
No, not at all. And also, there was no engines.
Oh, go ahead, Stan.
There were no engines. If there weren't things that you'd expect to find if it was an airplane, certainly, wings and tail and engines. But with a balloon, where's all this lightweight metal coming from? Balloons. I like one of the pieces of one of the things that shows up is a picture of General Ramey and Colonel Thomas Jefferson Dubose, who was Ramey's assistant, if you will. And they were with the stuff, and Ramey is holding a piece of paper in his hand because they were very good cameras, 4x5 press cameras. You can read some of the words, and it looks like victims of the wreck. And anybody ever hear of a balloon that could be said to have victims of the wreck? That makes no sense at all. So there were tantalizing things. But remember, the military took care of this within 2 days. I mean, the first day's headline, Army captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. The next day, General empties Roswell saucer. That was the end of it.
Yes. And everybody forgot about it.
Yeah, until I got involved, I hate to say how long later, 1978, for goodness sakes. This happened in 1947. And I stumbled across it. I'm not going to say I was looking for stories about crash saucer, not at all. I might as well tell you how it happened. I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, giving a lecture at Louisiana State University, and earlier in the day, I was brought by some of the students to the big television station in town. I was supposed to do 3 interviews, and I'd done the first 2, and the third reporter was nowhere to be seen. So the station manager's giving me coffee, he's talking to me, and out of the blue, he says, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. And being the great researcher I am, I said, who's he? Well, his claim to fame, according to the television station guy, was he found wreckage of one of those saucers you're interested in when he was in the military. That got my attention because he was being serious. There was nobody around. He wasn't telling stories or anything like that. And I said, what do you know about him? He lives in Houma. That couldn't tell me a darn thing. I didn't know where Houma was. It's one of the major cities in Louisiana. But he's a great guy. Rolled ham radio buddies.
Wow, what a
you ought to talk to him.
Jeez.
Yeah, just me being curious, I guess. And so the next day, I was busy that day, and things went very well. What encouraged me was things went very well at the lecture that I gave at LSU. The next morning, I was at the airport early. I was going someplace else. And I decided, I'm going to try to call that Jesse Marcel. And, I surprised kids when I said I called information. What do you mean? Didn't you look it up on your computer? I didn't have a computer. This was 1978. You talk to operators, which is nice because they know something about the area you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I was looking for Jesse Marcel in Houma, wherever it was. And so there was a number for him. I called him. He told me a story. And people say, why did he talk to you? I thought that was all classified. I said, well, his name was in the newspapers. His picture was in many newspapers around the world. Chinese newspapers even had Jesse's picture. And so that got me intrigued. I was very impressed with Jesse, partly because I'm nuclear, and this was the only nuclear, the debunkers always forget to tell you, this was the only group in the world that had nuclear weapons at that time. The first Soviet nuclear weapon wasn't exploded until 1949. This is 1947. And it was exploded, carried by the guys, the 509th at Roswell. So this wasn't just a bunch of guys with nothing better to do but make up stories. They were the first line of offense, if you will, as the Cold War wore on. That's what was our retaliatory place, was Roswell. The only atomic bombing group in the world. They dropped the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 2 more in Operation Crossroads. So it's very important to realize we're not talking about dinks with nothing better to do. They had their fingers on the button, as they like to say today. And so I really got hooked by Jesse and his story, and I shared the story with Bill Moore, a researcher with whom I had worked before. Within the next year, we found 62 people connected with Roswell. And of course, today, none of the original, all but one original witness is left. There were a lot of them, but it's 70 years later. Yeah, so we had to make hay while the sun shine.
It's amazing. And I was speaking to Kevin D. Randall in the last podcast, and we had mentioned the same thing about using telephones, because I grew up through the 80s and 90s, so I remember when you actually could speak to an operator. And sometimes that was actually more efficient than trying to use the internet, because it was a more trusting time. So you could call an area and an operator would say, oh, that's Joe so-and-so down the street. And you could get information that way. So it was sometimes more efficient.
Yeah. Well, it worked, and it kept me busy. And the next year after that, incidentally, after those first 62, we found 30 more witnesses, people who were at the base at the time and so forth. And remember, Roswell Army Airfield, which later became Walker Air Force Base, was a major installation. There were thousands of people who worked there. They had big bombers ready to deliver atomic bombs. Everybody had a security clearance. It's a very special place. Now, I should say something about Roswell. it's in the middle of nowhere. And that's important because that was one of the reasons it was there, is that there weren't a lot of people around. Remember, New Mexico was where the first atomic bomb was exploded at Trinity site. Mm-hmm. You certainly don't want people nearby then. New Mexico was the place where White Sands Missile Range was firing missiles all over the place. Again, you don't want to have a lot of people around. And you want to be able to keep your eyes open for Russian spies as well. So Roswell is 200 miles from Amarillo, 200 miles from Albuquerque, 200 miles from El Paso. If you're there, it's because you want to be there. And I must say, and we were there at the annual celebration, the Roswell Festival. This past year, over 204,000 people visited the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell. The population of the city is about 50,000. So, it's the major tourist attraction in the whole state.
Sure. And what was the population, do you recall, in 1947?
25,000. 25,000.
That's quite the increase, plus tourism.
And that's when the base was open back then. It's no longer open.
So it was
closed in the mid-60s. Well, it was closed for an interesting reason. New Mexico didn't vote for Lyndon Johnson in 1964. So he closed the base and moved it to, of all places, Texas. Can you believe that? Here you got this great airfield.
Are you saying that was a political move, Stan?
Oh, it was totally a political move. Wow, but who was more political than Lyndon Johnson? It was a great place to have an air base. The German pilots used to come over and fly there too. There are no mountains close by. Mm-hmm. It's at high altitude, at 3,500 feet, the clear skies. And they've got a 13,000-foot runway there, which is very large, believe me. But Lyndon closed it and built new ones in Texas. It's a funny part of the story, really. He was punishing New Mexico for not voting for him, but that was Lyndon's way. But, the story of Roswell, I had an earlier attempt at finding out more. I ran across a witness who had a great case, and he said, you ought to talk to my mom. So I did. Her name was Lydia Sleppy. She was based in Albuquerque, and she did have a good sighting, and she's the first one who told me about, there was a story from their radio affiliate. She worked at a radio station in Albuquerque, their Roswell affiliate. She took the call from somebody in Roswell saying that there'd been a crash of a saucer and the military was carrying it away. Mm-hmm. And when she started to put that out on the wire, it was interrupted, supposedly, and the FBI said, discontinue this story. And she asked the guy down in Roswell, what should I do? Discontinue it. Stop it. When the government spoke, you listened back then.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess maybe that explains part of the psychology of not following up on this, because it really is a wonder, because how many times has a newspaper legitimately put on the headline, a UFO crash? I would say since then, maybe never, unless it's, tabloid.
Well, there are a few others. There was a crash in Aztec, New Mexico. There's one in...
Did that make headlines as well?
Did it make headline news? I don't think so.
Well, there were stories, but they weren't. They didn't go around the country the way the Roswell story did. Well, they put the kibosh on that very quickly.
Yeah, well, and I understand how they've become more efficient since then, but because it was a little bit sloppy in those earlier days, why weren't there people just gnawing at the bit, biting at the bit, just trying, like, wait a minute, how did they backtrack on the story, and where were the bulldog investigators then?
Well, until I got involved, Roswell was mentioned, I think, twice in UFO literature between 47 and 78. It just wasn't. There was one guy did a study of the sightings of 1947 UFO sightings and did a whole report on it for NICAP. And there's one paragraph on Roswell, and it dismisses it as a hoax. That was it. So why would anybody else look for it, And besides, who wants to go to Roswell? It's out in the middle of nowhere.
Oh, I love going to Roswell. I love New Mexico. That's one of our favorite little vacation getaway.
Well, I like it too. I mean, I grew up in New Jersey. Of course, I'd like New Mexico.
Well, me too, and I'm speaking from New Jersey right now, so I feel you. But yeah, that wide open space, the sunsets, the sunrises, just it's so grounding. At least for me, coming from the Northeast here and living in New York and New Jersey.
I'll tell you, one time going into Albuquerque, the pilot on the plane said, I'm sorry, folks, the visibility is only 100 miles today. You can't see 10 miles in Jersey.
Right. Kathleen, for yourself, when did you find out about the Roswell incident and garner your own interest in it?
I found out about Roswell when I was a fan of Stanton Friedman and was attending MUFON symposiums. And Stanton spoke at the MUFON symposium about the Roswell crash and his investigation and showed some of his evidence. And I was immediately enthralled with the idea of this crash that actually happened and was covered up by the government. And one of my favorite stories is what happened when Jesse Marcel took this evidence into General Ramey's office at the 8th Air Force office in Fort Worth. And he said that what he did is he laid the samples that he had taken with him out on Ramey's desk. And then he was taken up to the map room and asked to point out the location of where the debris was found. And that when he returned to Ramey's office, the debris was missing and it had been replaced by a fallen weather balloon. And then the photographers came in and took photographs of this weather balloon that was obviously a weather balloon. And that is what they used in the newspaper articles as part of the cover-up. It was pretty insulting to Jesse Marcel to say that a man who had such a high position, lieutenant in the Army Air Force. Major, that's correct. And who was responsible for these nuclear weapons, was not able to identify a common weather balloon. That was, I can't imagine what he must have gone through having to keep his mouth closed.
And he was ordered. And to follow orders.
And to look like an idiot. Just look like an idiot, which he definitely was not.
But for the higher cause, right?
Yes, for the higher cause.
Mm-hmm. Well, and, oftentimes skeptics will use Occam's razor as an argument. There are two explanations for something. The simpler one is usually the better one. And, if I could extrapolate that a little bit further, it seems to me, following this over the past 20-something years, that principle actually works better for the work, Stan, that you've done and other ufologists, because the skeptics are trying so hard to come up with an alternative explanation. I mean, they're really reaching often and, contradicting themselves.
Remember, rule number one for debunkers is don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up.
Something that the skeptics tend to do is they tend to use the cover story, the disinformation that is given to the public, as the real story. So, for example, Mac Brazel changed his story between the time he went in and made his first report and then made a second report after he had been detained by the Army for a period of 3 or 4 days. And so they would use that second report, which was he was told that he needed to say, rather than the original truthful report of what happened. So over and over again, the disinformants, and you might call them debunkers, but I say they put the debunk into the story. They don't take it out. And so they tend to do that sort of thing. They will quote the disinformation that has been put out about any case.
Well, it sounds like it's a scapegoat, right? That way you don't even have to make an argument.
Right.
Yep. I want to ask you this. We only have a few minutes left before the next break. I remember some years ago, Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Richard French had come out and said, "Hey, I know what happened with the UFOs and why they crashed." The first one was hit with an electromagnetic pulse from an experimental Air Force craft. And then the second one, I don't know how that crashed, but the second one was like a rescue craft to go in and rescue the one that crashed. Stan, where do you fall on that?
Well, I found it's total baloney.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I've talked to people who were there at the time. They're dead now, incidentally, so I can't tell you who to talk to, but it's baloney. I talked to people who went out there. I talked to Cavett. I talked to Jesse. I talked to several other people at the base. Remember, again, the people at the base were at the front line of military capability. Roswell was king. They had atomic bombs. Nobody else had them at that time. So they were very concerned about not only keeping their bombs safe, so to speak, but making sure that no spies got there. Remember, we're not talking about a big city area now. We're talking about a very small town. And they had to be very clear that there were no Russian spies getting through.
All right. You know, we're coming up on the second break, Stan, if you can hold it right there. This is Alan B. Smith, host for Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network, and we will be right back after this quick break, so hang in there.
You didn't forget what's coming up tonight, did you? Hi, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Never miss that interview you were looking forward to or the show on your favorite topic. Follow IRN on Twitter, I_R_N, and get reminders about the evening's live shows as well as fun and important updates throughout the week. That's I_R_N, and never miss a great show again. Hello, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Remember, you can take your Inception Radio shows on the go. Just download the Inception Radio Network app for your iPhone, iPad, or Android smartphones and access live shows, past shows, guest lineups, and much more. Just visit the iTunes Store or the Google Play Marketplace and download it today for free.
Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith on the Inception Radio Network, and my guests tonight are Stanton Friedman and Kathleen Marden. This is a fascinating conversation. I'm absolutely loving this, and I'm sure you are too, and will continue to do so over the next hour here. And taking us out of the break was White Flag by Dido. It's one of my favorite songs. I don't know, it just puts me in a nice contemplative, reflective state of mind. Which leads me into something that actually Stanton had brought up between the break. He wanted to, discuss about what the significance of the Roswell UFO crash was or is. And so, Stan, what's your take on that?
Well, the big thing is that we suddenly had proof. This wasn't the first sighting. Kenneth Arnold's, made noises, and we found out there were lots of sightings. Mm-hmm. But when you've got wreckage and bodies, you suddenly realize that you're confronted with something of enormous significance. These guys weren't from around here. The vehicle certainly wasn't. We didn't know what they wanted. They're near our nuclear weapons. This is scary. What does this mean for mankind? So they had to be extremely careful about what information they let out. Because there were some people who knew darn well, that there may be horrible stuff in store for us. This is the first mission of a bunch of bad guys, if you will. Mm-hmm. And it might, we have attracted the attention of somebody else from out there. And this was a nuclear group. The nuclear groups realize that if you want to get to the stars, nuclear is the way to go. Some people think about chemical rockets, and it's pretty darn hard with a chemical rocket to get to the stars. But I worked on fission and fusion propulsion systems, a study of fusion, back in 1962. And certainly in 47, the atomic bombing group, the 509th at Roswell, was well aware of the enormous change in the amount of energy you have available when you go from chemical to nuclear. To illustrate that, a big bomb in 1944 was a 10-ton blockbuster. It released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite. One bomb took a big B-29 to carry it. Well, the first atomic bomb the next year, in 1945, about 16,000 tons of dynamite. And the first H-bomb, first fusion device, 1952. 10 million tons of dynamite. And later, the Russians set one off, Tsar Bomba, 57 million tons of dynamite in one stinking weapon. So it was clear to the military guys that we've got a whole new ball game here. And, we got suckered in a way. People asked the general who headed up the atomic bombing program, in 1948, how long before the Russians have their nuclear bomb? And he hemmed and hawed and said, well, they didn't have the industrial development that we had. They'd been damaged by the war, which we hadn't been, and so forth. He said it should take them at least 8 years. And besides, they don't have a means for transporting it. The first atomic bomb from the Russians was the next year, 1949. And they had taken one of our B-29s, which we had left there, damaged. And they built a whole bunch of them, like Chinese copies, if you will.
Amazing, yeah.
So the change in the situation from, nothing to worry about, folks, it'll be years before, and they can't match us, and so forth. And then suddenly, holy cow, 1949, we didn't even have radar around the United States to let us know when anybody was coming, because the Russians couldn't get here. What was the problem? So there were things going on in the background, but certainly with the Roswell information, and remember there was an Aztec, New Mexico crash in 48, the very next year. Suddenly, there was this whole compartment over here. What are we doing about alien visitors? What do they want? Where are they from? Are they going to work with the Russians or the Chinese? So that was not public discussion. That was on the inner circle. But there were people worried about it, that's for sure. And so that was one of the reasons for keeping secret. You didn't want to scare the heck out of people, and we didn't have answers. So
I
even to this day...
You're going down a rabbit hole, because once you... Even if you think those are legitimate reasons, once you start on down the path of a cover-up, then how do you backtrack?
You don't. Who wants to admit we've only been lying for 70 years, folks. That puts anybody in power at jeopardy of being taken out of power.
Yeah, and I think you're right. If I could say it, metaphysically speaking or sociologically speaking, there's a show, Twin Peaks, and the third season came out this year on Showtime. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but one of the characters on the show is this evil sort of demon type of character or spirit, and people argue on the show whether it's just all allegory or it's fantasy or whatever it is. But in this past season, they showed the origin of this evil spirit, and it was the explosion of the first atomic bomb. And this is where he was born. He was born out of this moment. And it seems to me that it was a commentary on humankind's original sin as a galactic species. And
interesting.
Yes.
Right. That sure, we have our other religious stories for original sin, etc. But as a galactic species, as a planetary, interplanetary species, that was our original sin, and then we were on lockdown. I don't know if that's true or not, but it is interesting that it's right around that time when UFO reports really spike.
Did you know that when the nuclear bomb was being developed, and there were nuclear installations where UFOs were showing up, and the scientists were seeing the UFOs around these nuclear installations. And originally, they speculated that perhaps they were a byproduct of the nuclear process.
Huh.
So that was interesting to me, that they thought it was this demon that came out of it.
Oh my gosh, really? I'd not heard that before.
Yes.
Wow. And that brings me back to a question that, I was touching on before we went to the break. Kathleen, what do you think caused the UFO to crash? And is that why that they are more, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, secretive in their observance of us, more clandestine?
Boy, I don't know. I don't even have a speculation on what caused it to crash. I don't know if it had something to do with the weather, if it had something to do with nuclear installations. I really don't have a speculation on that. I only know that there is considerable evidence that something actually did crash there, that there were high security measures at the Foster Ranch where it did crash, that unscheduled flights were made to Roswell from Washington, D.C., from White Sands, from Kirtland in California, and from Fort Bliss. So there was a lot of activity. And why would all of this activity be taking place in that time frame if nothing had happened? Or, as the government later said, that it was a mogul balloon. Well, a mogul balloon was only a top secret kind of spying balloon. It was made up of 23 neoprene balloons to pick up sonic vibrations in the atmosphere from distant nuclear explosions. 23 neoprene balloons landing on the Foster Ranch would not have drawn all of those officials from all of the different areas that they came in from.
I do have a speculation as to why it crashed, because there was another crash at the same time over in the plains of San Agustin, where the huge radio telescope is these days, in New Mexico. I think there might have been a mid-air collision, because one witness described one that crashed on the ground with a crack on the side, as if it had been struck by something. And if you look, that we know that there were rocket tests scheduled for the morning of the crash, and that means the radar was on, because we were tracking rockets. And I think we might suggest that if there were two saucers flying together, a pilot and a wingman, we would call it, that's the way we do things, if they turn the radar on or they cross the radar beam, this is out in the middle of nowhere, no signs of civilization around there for miles and miles, that they might have zipped through the beam of the radar. It was a tracking radar. It wasn't going around, round and round to detect something going by. They knew what was going on. There was a rocket was being fired. If they ran into the radar beam, it might have discombobulated, affected the guidance system, the propulsion system. All it would take would be a momentary glitch, and whammo, one hits the other. Well, and I asked an Air Force general, if you have a mid-air collision, is the damage usually the same to the two aircraft? And he said no. Usually one makes it and one doesn't. So if we have an explosion, and Jesse Marcel in our first conversation said he thought there had to be a mid-air explosion because there was no radar and because the wreckage was spread out over such a wide area. So if you have a mid-air explosion there and the other one going the other way over the plains of San Augustine and being picked up, that might explain it. I'm not guaranteeing that, but it seems reasonable under the circumstances there. Well, one explanation.
Well, we're talking about, something that seems magical. It seems otherworldly, that it can, come and go from distant star systems. It can perform anti-gravity feats that are seemingly unimaginable. And yet, if they are able to do all these things, then they are relying on physics, and physics are real. And
and I'm a physicist, and I don't see anything unreal about this. Look, one of my things that I live by is that technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. I mean, look at our own history. Magellan took 3 years to go around the world. 3 years. His ship did. He didn't make it. Now, the space station goes around 90 minutes. But it isn't a fast sailing boat. It's entirely different, So we shouldn't be surprised. Look at a slide rule. I used a slide rule when I started working in industry. It doesn't compare with the computer that's on my desk. No comparison whatsoever. Progress comes from doing things differently. So if somebody got started a little bit before we did, what's a million years on their technological development, we would expect them to be able to do things that we can't do. There's no surprise there.
Right, and I know it's speculation, but I could imagine that if they were visiting and keeping an eye on us, perhaps they did not know everything about us, and perhaps they were taken a bit by surprise by a directed radio wave. I don't know, but it's certainly not out of the realm of physical possibility if you're using some sort of electromagnetic propulsion system.
Well, even if you're not using an electromagnetic propulsion system, radar was new at that time. There wasn't a lot of radar around. So if they zipped around the planet Earth, they might not have noticed any radar because there wasn't much of it there. Roswell, in other words, or not Roswell, but White Sands Missile Range, New Mexico, did have radar installations because we were firing missiles. Rockets. We had to keep track of them. And as a matter of fact, one of them went to Mexico. It wasn't supposed to, but went the wrong way. Too bad. But we have to think in terms of New Mexico being a hotbed of military research and development activities. 2 of the 3 nuclear weapons labs in the United States were in New Mexico, Los Alamos and Sandia. And so that's why you worry about spies there. But it also means that it's a place where you can test far out stuff because there aren't many people around. New Mexico is the 5th least densely populated states. Of all 50, it ranks 5th of population density. Not much in the way of people.
Kathleen, I know this is a mite bit off topic, but I am curious. Benny and Barney Hill, did they ever, comment on, I don't know if they were aware to the degree that people are now, but were they aware of the Roswell incident, and did they have any thoughts on the matter?
Betty was aware of the Roswell incident. Barney died in 1969 at the age of 46, and so this was before 1978 when Stanton heard about Roswell and began his research. So Barney was not aware of it, but Betty was, and Betty had a great deal of admiration for Stanton Friedman and followed his work and did believe that Roswell did have a UFO crash.
And I know this is again reaching, but did she think that perhaps they're the same beings that abducted them?
Well, she thought that they might have been, but the original sketches that were done were a little bit different. She didn't remember like any little cups on the ends of the fingers, such as were drawn by the alleged nurse who had examined the bodies and had drawn sketches for Glenn Dennis from the funeral home, the Ballard Funeral Home. So they seemed a little bit different, but they also had similar characteristics. So I think that she believed they were probably from the same family of non-human entities.
Kathleen and Stan, do you both believe that there was one UFO crash in Roswell, New Mexico?
Well, I think there was one in Corona and one in the plains of San Augustine.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
correct. Yes,
I think there were two, in other words. And then there was another one in Aztec. There's an excellent book, The Aztec Incident, by Scott and Suzanne Ramsey. Aztec is up in the northwest corner of New Mexico, near the Four Corners area. Mm-hmm. And that was just the next year, but they did a bang-up job on the research. They found witnesses and paperwork and all kinds of goodies. So, where there's one, there's more, and that's why I mentioned the mid-air collision, is that two went down at the same time. So that's one possibility. Especially after the general told me that usually the damage isn't symmetric, that is, one makes it and one doesn't. Well, that describes Roswell. It went over that way.
I think I have favored the speculation that one sort of exploded over the Foster Ranch and might have touched the ground, and then like a saucer or a stone skipping across water, it became airborne again and then ended up crashing at the second site.
Interesting.
Oh.
Okay. And either of these, one or two crashes, whatever they are, were there actual alien beings?
Yes.
Yes.
Inside them. Okay. And were
I
they
recently
alive, or did they all die?
4 out of 5 were dead, apparently.
Mm-hmm. And those were supposed to be in just one craft, correct?
Well, yeah, whether there were ones over in the plains of San Augustine where the second crash was, we think so. We're told that there were. But because I heard about them, the bodies out lecturing again, and somebody said, "Did you ever hear anything about a crash saucer in New Mexico?" And I said, "Well, yes, I have. Tell me more." And he told me about his friend Barney Barnett over in the plains of San Augustine. He was a federal officer, and the crash over there, and there were bodies there. He saw them.
Kathleen?
But we talked about them. It didn't make it into the press.
Yes.
Yeah, and you think how many bodies? Do you agree with Stan's assessment?
Oh, yes. I think there were probably about 4 or 5 bodies from what I've heard. And I recently talked to a woman who told me that her grandmother-in-law had worked at the Pentagon and was called to White Sands after the crash and went into a hangar there and saw these small, emaciated white bodies in the hangar. And she said that initially they were trying to identify what they actually were because they had never seen anything like that before. I said to her, I want to talk to your grandmother-in-law. And she said, unfortunately, she had passed away. So that's just another story. I've heard many of people who claim to have been eyewitnesses to not only the crash, but the bodies.
Stan?
I should stress that people who had security clearances and so forth at that time took their security oaths very seriously because they knew the penalty for speaking out of turn was very severe. It could be death. It could be life imprisonment, loss of all future benefits, and veterans worry about that sort of thing. People took security very seriously back then. And they knew about the Russian spies during the war. And so it wasn't an unrealistic thought that somebody's trying to figure out what we're doing here if we're at the peak of technological advancement. So people today, average Joe Blow, may not think much about security. But back then, believe me, they did think a great deal about security and keeping your mouth shut.
Well, with both of you, the amount of research that you've done, you've certainly covered your share of the spook world. And I do wonder, in that time period, because of World War II, were we far more refined in our abilities in international spying and less refined in our abilities to keep our own secrets from ourselves? Was there a little bit more of a trust factor between fellow U.S. citizens and do you get where I'm going?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it was loose lips sink ships. I remember that from World War II. Mm-hmm. There was great stress on keeping your, you couldn't talk about where your relatives were who were overseas. Mm-hmm. That they didn't want the Germans to know about troop movements, for example. And they were very, one of the things about when they dropped the first atomic bomb, they wanted to make sure nobody knew where they were going to drop it because they were fearful that the Japanese would move American prisoners of war to that city. Go ahead, if they found out which city would be targeted. So, no, I think, and everybody, much more so then than now, everybody had a family relative who was in the military and who would read them the riot act about, can't talk about this, can't talk about that. Mm-hmm. And everywhere you turn, there may be spies. It was built into the system at that time, especially after we found out that the Russians had spies mixed up with the nuclear business. Remember, there were two, the Rosenbergs, man and a woman, were executed for being spies.
It was big news.
Hit home.
Oh, yeah, and I mean, that was a huge part of our education growing up. I don't know about now, but I remember we specifically spent quite a bit of time on that. And, by the time you come out of that lesson, you fear, you know that you're not supposed to, break that sanctity. And there will be consequences. I'm sorry, Kathleen, you're going to say something?
And not only that, but I was, let me give an example. I was having a conversation with a man who was a retired Air Force officer, and he gave me some information about the Air Force's knowledge of UFOs. And I said to him, would you please put that in writing for me? And he said no. And I said, will you put it in writing and keep it in a safe deposit box that I will have access to after you pass? And he said no. And I said, why? And he said, it's a matter of honor and a matter of loyalty to my country, he said. Not only that, but to all of the men that I served with and to my family. Those were his words.
and that carries a lot of weight. And I think you did touch on a point, Stan, as well. Someone in my family who's in the military had posted something on Facebook about this. It was an article, and I think it was a very good point that in the military that we have now, the people who serve, a large portion of that are part of a military family continuum. And so you have a large number of the population that are not concerned as in the same way when we go to war, or when we hear about someone spilling secrets. The gravity of that does not weigh on you as much when your father or your brother, or your sister-in-law are involved in combat and action and service to the country. So I do wonder, how much of a clamp can they keep down on this until we get another Snowden who blows it open, or is it impossible? We'll pick it up when we get back after this last break. This is Alan B. Smith on the Inception Radio Network. I'm talking with Stanton Friedman and Kathleen Marden. Hang in there. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith, your host tonight. I have two amazing guests. This conversation has been fascinating, and we've gone down so many paths along the way, starting with Roswell, New Mexico. But again, like we've covered these subjects so many times, it's not just a linear story with any of these topics. There are so many overlapping factors that play a part in, what ostensibly was a cover-up of a UFO crash, and I had, left us, off in the last segment with the thought of our citizens not taking seriously the sanctity of an oath, and being in service to the country because they don't have a direct emotional experience to those who have to put their lives on the line in service of the country. And what are the consequences of that? Do we get more Edward Snowdens? Kathleen, what do you think?
Boy, let's defer to Stanton Friedman.
Oh, okay.
That's because I'm older and I was around during World War II. Now, I think that what you say is true. That is, that there are a much smaller segment of the population that's aware of the necessity of keeping secrets and the loose lips sink ships kind of attitude, and also about Russian spies, other spies. I think that in our everyday life, most of us don't have to worry about this. And we aren't spending the huge amounts of money on developing new classified technology, which leads to keeping secrets, all over the place. So I think that we pay much less attention to it now. But I think the government is very concerned because they know that there are Russian spies and Chinese spies. And they know that if our enemies get a hold of the technology we've developed, they may be ahead of us if they have what they have and what we have. Mm-hmm. So it's very important from a serious viewpoint about national security that we not let information out about the newest, the latest, the best developments. And even what we've learned about what they have learned, what we've learned from Russian stuff, you can't put that out in the open. So I think many people just don't even think in terms of national security as something they're concerned with. But the people who have to take it very, very seriously.
Well, we have seen in recent days, leaking seems to be commonplace.
Well, I don't know about any hotspot military secrets that are being leaked much.
Right. It depends upon the type of information that's being leaked. And as I'm thinking about this, back in that time frame of the Roswell crash in the late 40s, the early 50s, I think that people had a different attitude There was a lot of loyalty toward the country, and it was my country, right or wrong. And then since then, we have had a lot of problems in the federal government where, for example, Richard Nixon with Watergate. And I think that it was very disappointing to the public because we were beginning to perceive our government in a different light. We had the Vietnam War, and we knew about all of the illegal and unethical activities that our government was, and particularly the President of the United States, was perpetrating to keep that war going when it shouldn't have been. And I even learned that Ho Chi Minh had originally wanted to establish a democracy in Vietnam. And the letter was given to the CIA. The CIA never delivered it to President Eisenhower. So that sort of thing took place. There is a lot of disappointment, I think, in our government and unethical behavior in our government. And I don't know that we were aware of that sort of thing back in the 1940s when Stanton was a 16-year-old boy at least, and I was just being born. So what about it, Stan?
I was working on being born.
Well, I think what Kathy says is true. There is an entirely different sociological realm, so to speak, at the time. I remember people working in war industries, and remember, the Second World War taught us a lot of lessons. One of them was there was rationing. You didn't have access to butter and all kinds of other things, meat, only certain days, and so forth and so on. This was all, but we had to have an attitude that we were all in this together. That was the thing about rationing. It didn't matter who you were, how much money you had. There were certain rules, things that you had to keep track of. And certainly the keeping secrets was a part of that story, and everybody knew that. I've had people tell me that surely those guys, Roswell or whatever, would have told their wives what they were doing. I wrote a book about Operation Majestic 12, 12 people keeping incredible secrets. And I'd never told my wife anything classified. I wouldn't think of doing that, strong penalties. But I recognize that it would be stupid to do that. You don't know where the spies are, and you don't know where your wife is going to say what to whom, under what circumstances. So it gets pounded into you. I was made a courier to carry my own classified slides because they weren't ready in time for the regular courier. I was giving a classified lecture on radiation shielding for nuclear airplanes. But anyway, and they made me a courier, and they sat me down, and I was so glad to get rid of those slides. I mean, they stressed, if the plane crashes, they wanted my itinerary. If the plane crashes, we don't care about you, but we want to recover this classified material, so we need your detailed itinerary. And the stuff doesn't go in the trunk of your car, the slides. No, they got to be with you on your person. And I was so glad to get rid of that stuff because they really make it sound like somebody's paying attention and you better do the job properly or you're in deep trouble. Mm-hmm. Look, if you left something classified out on your desk in a classified facility, guards at the door, no access to anybody from the outside, if you left a classified report out on your desk, the guards went around every night. And you get a call at 10:30 or 11 at night. You left some classified material. You come in and inventory all your documents now. Wow. You really didn't want that to happen. More than once. Once was too many times, but after that, you were very, very conscious of keeping secrets.
I think we were sort of leaning towards this before, that the military seems to be very good at keeping secrets. And so Kathleen, I mean, I guess that's probably where you stand, right? I mean, if there was any other incident, a UFO sighting or crash or what have you, even today, if the military steps in and takes control, then I'm assuming you believe that, there will be no loose lips, right? Or likely not. Yeah.
That is correct. Yes, I don't think that there will be. It would be classified above top secret code word, and those kinds of secrets are not released to the public. And you loosely lip sync ships, and you're not going to talk about that kind of thing. The consequences on the American public could be devastating, with a great deal of distress caused to individuals without any preparation for what had occurred.
Yeah, why do you think that people did eventually come out and speak about Roswell, New Mexico, and the crash of Corona?
Well, I told you how I got the story. There were articles in the paper on the day when the recovery was made, and then a day later the cover-up ensued.
But why would people come out and why would they come out and even later and speak about it if they were told not to?
Well, they were only referred. Well, look, it was 40 years later, and people asked about it. But we were assiduous in trying to track down people. One of the big things was, for example, that Walter Haut, who was the base public information officer in a World War II bombardier, incidentally, 20 missions over Japan, he had a base yearbook. So when I discovered him, I was lucky. I called the newspaper and found out that he worked there. I didn't expect that at all. I was looking for anybody who could tell me anything about him. He works here. What? His wife works here. He didn't work there. His wife did. But that's how I found him. I was very, very lucky. But you really, people were conscientious. And what they told me initially, what I heard, was stuff that I found later in old newspapers. There were articles, and some reporters were assiduous in tracking things down. But I think they thought, if Joe talked, I guess I can. Or, it's so long ago, it can't possibly be still secret. And we don't have any technological information from back then that's worth anything today anyway, and so forth and so on. Also, Kathy hit it before. Our attitude toward the government had changed.
I think back in the 1970s, too, Stan, there was a lot in the news about UFOs. And on television, it was a time when the Travis Walton case, for example, had made big news nationwide, maybe worldwide. We had the famous Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker case. Yes. There were some big cases of alien abduction in that time frame. And so it wasn't so important to hide this little crash saucer incident that occurred many, many years before that, given the idea that people were actually being taken aboard craft.
Yeah, there hadn't been any abductions that we knew about back in the early days, 40s and 50s. And, we didn't know about them. There were people abducted, but they weren't going to speak out. Fear of ridicule was the thing.
Yeah, it does seem to me that even in recent years, those who have come out and shared their stories, whatever they may be, UFO related, it's post active duty and post reserves, and I feel like as long as they're actually working for the government, they don't come out and say anything. So, and in some sense, they're still honoring in that oath. But I think. Yeah, you make a really good point. People have lost a lot of trust. And if they think that their higher duty is to the Constitution and to the Republic itself, then maybe they will come out and say something. I want to ask you a very, again, nostalgic question. The sightings. Remember the show Sightings?
That was a long time ago, wasn't it?
that was the 90s. Do you feel like that show actually had an impact on public perception of this ufological enterprise?
I think anything that was on the tube did. I think that the wider the discussion, the more people who say, well, I saw one of those when I was in, it stimulates discussion and release of information, personal experiences, as opposed to being part of a team that was examining the characteristics of UFO wreckage. That's another story. We don't get many of those reports, But having seen UFOs, having helped recover wreckage, whatever, that's a little different. You're just telling about an experience. You don't have the pieces, you don't have the characteristics, you don't have what they're made out of, what their capabilities are, all that sort of stuff. So I think even today, when I check my audiences at the end of a lecture, I ask how many people here believe they've seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer, having defined my terms in the lecture. And I just want you to raise your hand, and I'm not asking for names or anything. And so how many believe they've seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer? Just raise your hand. And I go around pointing and counting at the same time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Typically, it's 10% of the audience. Then I ask, how many of you reported what you saw? 90% of the hands go down. Yeah. I've done this hundreds of times. And if there's still hands when I go through that who did report it, I'll ask, how many of you were in the military at the time? And if there's still hands, you want to tell us about it. Now I put the people on the spot. One guy in front of 1,300 people says, I can't. They told me not to say anything. Another guy said, they took my pictures. Long silence. So I said, I'm sure the audience would like to hear the rest of that story. Well, it turns out he remained seated. I said, I'm not asking your name, give him a microphone. And he was an officer, a pilot, and the plane 20 miles ahead, they were flying across the Pacific, 20 miles ahead, radioed back that saucer heading your way. And they had gun cameras, and they took pictures, and they contacted the base intelligence office. And when they landed, the film got taken, and they got debriefed and told never to say anything. And under those conditions, somebody tells you never to say anything, and you're in the military, you keep your mouth shut. And a little story out of Vietnam. A guy came up to me after a lecture. He said, I'll talk to you later, when I asked, if he'd tell me more. So he comes over, and he was flying a helicopter in Nam. And this sleek vehicle came out, suddenly showed up, circled around them twice. They thought for sure that it was a new Russian vehicle. They were going to be splattered across the countryside. And it took off. So when they landed, he dutifully reported the case. Government wants to know about new technology showing up in the battlefield. And the next day, the commander of the base comes over to him, Lieutenant Jones, you didn't see anything strange yesterday, did you? No, sir. No, I did, and I reported it, he said first. And then the colonel says, you didn't hear me, Lieutenant Jones. You didn't see anything strange yesterday, did you? No, sir. It was very clear what he wanted him to say. And if he wanted to keep, you like flying, was another question asked along the way. Yes, sir. You didn't see anything, did you? No, sir. What can I say? Everybody has had these kind of experiences when they talk to a number of former military people.
Yeah, well, and the reason I was starting with the show, 20-some years ago, is because when that show came on, though it was creative sometimes in its telling, it really wasn't sensationalism. Fast forward to today, and there is an enormous amount of sensationalism on the topic of UFOs and extraterrestrials.
Yeah.
Is that trending in the wrong direction, or does it not matter?
Well, I don't think it matters, because I think the percentage of people who think that there is other life out there is very high today, and it wasn't 50 years ago. There were many people who thought we were the only ones around. Further thought, well, just that further thought that if there was anybody out there, they can't get here anyway. So, no problem.
To me, the decision is based upon how accurate the reports are. Mm-hmm. If it is fiction being presented as fact for the purpose of sensationalizing a story, then I'm very much opposed to that. But if it is presented as something that is extraordinary and did actually occur, and it's being presented accurately, then I think that that's a very good thing. And the television media is the one media where you're going to reach the largest number of people. There will be millions of people viewing it.
Right in front of me, I have the UFO Investigator's Handbook, the practical guide to researching, identifying, and documenting unexpected sightings by Craig Glenday, forward by Stanton Friedman. This book is from '99, and I wonder if you both have ever considered creating your own version of a UFO Investigator's Handbook, because I know there are a lot of people out there that do want to investigate, and my suspicion is, assuming that people are doing the right thing and they're grounded in data and proper research and approach, that the more people we have investigating, the better for ufology. And so, would you guys ever consider doing a book together, to help bring up another generation of investigators?
Well, we've done 3 books together.
Yes, and I really think that we should leave that to the Mutual UFO Network. They have a very, very good training program for field investigators. They have a very well-written field investigators manual, which is a handbook. And in fact, I wrote part of that manual. And I think that is the best place for anyone to go to if they want to learn to become a good field investigator. And that's what I did way back in 1991 when I wanted to investigate the Hill case myself, is to become a MUFON field investigator and undergo that training. It was very well worth it. And that's what I would recommend to anybody.
Okay, yeah, and I guess they can just go to MUFON.com and then search the site somewhere for that.
Yes.
They go to my website. They get MUFON's address. Is MUFON's address on your website, Kathy?
I believe that it is.
Yeah, because I know mine is. So go to the guys who've been spending a lot of time formatting and arranging things. We can't do it all.
And you've done an enormous amount, which is astounding in its own right. And I just imagine if we had tenfold as many, how far along may we be?
Pretty far.
Yes.
And, if we could get more media people getting involved. Mm-hmm. Incidentally, there's something that's happened very recently. Popular Science put out a whole issue, not Popular Science, the Scientific American, much higher level, put out a whole issue on looking for extraterrestrial life. And Newsweek magazine, a special edition, I just got it a week ago, all about life in the universe. It's 100 pages long, and it talks about UFOs in a serious way. And so I'm encouraged by that. I mean, Scientific American and Newsweek are 2 very respectable publications. And they were not, laughing about the subject at all.
No, and that's great. That's exactly what we need. To bring us back to the original topic of Roswell, so the craft that was recovered, what happened to that? Where did that go?
Well, we think the wreckage went to several places. One would be Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, because that's where the Foreign Technology Division of the Air Force was. I was there many times. I had a contract with them looking at foreign technology, Russian, not alien. But while I was there, I visited Project Blue Book and so forth. I'm sure some of it went to Los Alamos. They had a biology section there. They were very concerned about the effects of radiation on people. So if you're used to handling people, bodies, that's the place you send them. And so there has been plenty of opportunity for very competent people to get heavily involved in ufology on the inside instead of from the outside, the way we are. And some of them will talk, maybe, if we can convince enough of them that the people are entitled to know. And, I'm very curious about two major publications doing whole issues within a month period. That's, who else is going to pick up on that? When's the next one coming out? And I'll bet they sold well too. So that's always an encouragement to a magazine to put out something.
Yeah, I'm not dismissing it at all, but I think you're right. Every once in a while, I do see mainstream does put something out because I think it sells papers. It attracts viewers on occasion. Kathleen, so the craft that was recovered, what do you think happened with that technology?
I do believe that we did attempt to back engineer some of that technology, and that it took many, many years because, and I asked Bob Wood, Dr. Bob Wood, about that, who at one time was Stan's boss. And what he told me is that you have to be fairly close in terms of development to the point where that craft was, if you're going to be able to back engineer it. So maybe we're close to the development of, for example, night vision goggles, and that might have been something that came from that craft. There are other things such as fiber optics that perhaps might have been developed as a result of that. And I'm speculating here. I don't have evidence.
I can give you one example. I was reading I used to do a weekly science commentary about new developments. I read a lot of scientific literature, and there was one about the development of new and better permanent magnets, neodymium iron boron. And it mentioned in the article about these new ones that the original work on samarium cobalt, which were the leading permanent magnets way back in the 40s, that the work was done at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And so I think, as it turns out, the pieces would have been sent to labs, and you'd figure out what the heck is this stuff, and somebody would have said, well, I don't know where this is coming from or what it relates to, but it's samarium and cobalt. Why would you put those two together? And well, that's not your problem. We'll go to somebody else, and you measure the properties. And the guy comes back and said, I got the highest magnetic field from any material I've ever tested. Make a great permanent magnet. Okay, then you go to somebody else. How do you put together samarium and cobalt so that they make a sensible material? Well, when I was reading this article, the original work was done at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's where the wreckage would have been brought. So I think there's a slight example of where you grab a ball and run with it. Here's something different. Let's see what we can do. Oh, we can make that. Now, you can't go into your local Five and Dime and buy samarium and cobalt, but at least appropriate people would have been able to follow up on that. And I think, so you can call that back engineering if you want, but look, during World War II, if a German airplane crashed in England, we looked at the wreckage to see what we could learn about the materials that were used, stuff like that, if it hadn't been all destroyed by an explosion or something. It's standard practice. If an English plane crashed in Germany, let's look at the pieces. What are they doing that we aren't doing? This has been standard practice for a very long time. Make better spears, because we got the enemy one. Look what they did. So there's nothing surprising about that. And there are people who specialize in back engineering.
So, Kathleen, you do believe then that there was a UFO recovered and that there were alien beings recovered. And Stanton, you agree, correct?
Yes.
And this all originated from Roswell, New Mexico, the Corona crash.
Yeah, that was the earliest one, I think. And then came Aztec, and then came a place in Pennsylvania, and then came one in the northern part of, Washington State. There have been several crashes. But let's face it, it's perfectly clear if you can grab a hold of an advanced piece of technology, then maybe you can learn something that we don't yet know.
Yeah,
but that doesn't mean you can build another one. It doesn't mean you can build another. Look, you give the smartest people on the planet a digital wristwatch, $25 watch today, back in 1934. They'd have known it was a watch, keeps time. They could see there's a battery there if you look carefully.
Exactly.
Could they have duplicated the watch? No chance. Or even the chip? Not at all. We didn't have the capability of doing it then.
Yeah. That's a good point.
So somebody can give you great stuff. Mm-hmm. What?
That was a good point. Even if you knew what it was, you could recognize what its use is. It does not mean that you can grapple with its advanced technologies. That's it for the show. This went by so fast. Thank you so much, Stanton and Kathleen, for joining me. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having us. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So if you want to find out more about Stanton, go to stantonfriedman.com. That's spelled F-R-I-E-D, stantonfriedman.com. And Kathleen Marden is kathleen-marden.com. If you love ufology, then you have to check out all of their many books that they've worked on. Between the two of them, we have all a great deal to be thankful for. I know I am. And I'm also grateful to be part of this podcast on the Inception Radio Network. And that's it. Thank you again. This is Alan B. Smith. I want to thank Joe Champion, Bob Tarmac, and MJ Lucas. And until the next time, live in the mystery. Be well, everyone.
Thanks much.
Thank you. Good night.